Welcome back to Stab the Dragon Productions for episode number 200 and book review number 19. It is Friday, February 14th, 2025. It is 51 degrees here in Fort Worth, Texas. Today, we're going to study a book by F. Paul Pacult, American Still Life, the Jim Beam Story and the Making of the World's #1 Bourbon. Coming out of Hoboken, New Jersey, from John Wiley & Sons, 2003. This book is 240 pages, and I read it in January and February of 2025. I really like this book. I consider it to be outstanding. This book it's well written by a professional writer, you can tell. It's fun, it's informative, it's very well researched, and a very good American history book, actually, with an emphasis on bourbon and the Jim Beam family and the bourbon business. To me, this book is must-reading. If you work in the whiskey business, and I also highly recommend it for those who, like me, are whiskey nerds that just want to learn more about their hobby and their passion. You know, if bars, distilleries, and liquor stores had a bookshelf for books to sell, this should be on that shelf, definitely. Now, while I do this review, I'm going to have a pour of Jim Beam Rye. This is the white label, the 80 proof version, and this is a very decent pour. But the pre-Prohibition 90 proof rye is much better. I think Beam is phasing that one out, though. It's not on their website anymore, and it's getting scarce in the stores. When I went to get, I'd had that 90 proof rye before years ago and really liked it. And so I went to the stores in recent months because I knew I was doing this little study on Jim Beam. And lo and behold, Goody Goody didn't have any Jim Beam rye. And I asked him about it because that's where I had bought the last one that I got. And they said it just wasn't moving. Nobody was buying it. So they weren't selling it anymore at my local Goody Goody here in Fort Worth. So I went to Specs, and Specs had both the white bottle and the green bottle of the pre-Prohibition. But the pre-Prohibition rye, there was 2 left. And there was a whole bunch of this. And I asked the guy who worked there, and he said he thought they were getting rid of the pre-Prohibition 90 proof. So I check on the website, and sure enough, it's not there. Instead, just this white bottle is there. So that would be a disaster if that pre-Prohibition rye is going away permanently, because that was really good. I really liked it. All I have to do is really like something, and it goes away. That's just how it works. But I tend to be a rye guy, and so I'm going to drink this Jim Beam rye while I do this book review. And I will notice that the flavored Jim Beam whiskeys, you know, vanilla, and red stag, and whatever else they've got, those are still lots of them in the store. Shelves and shelves of flavored Jim Beam. But the rye? No, of course not. So, all right, this author, F. Paul Pacult. I think I'm saying his name right, Pacult. I watched a couple of reviews, and that seems to be how people are pronouncing it, Pacult. He is a world-renowned critic. He is an author on all things alcohol, alcoholic spirits and wines. He started off in the wine business, actually, and then only later in life did he switch over to whiskeys. I've stumbled across some of his writings and ratings of alcohol before I researched this topic, and so I've seen him in the business. Okay, now I just finished and did a review of Fred Noe III's book, Beam Straight Up. And so I wanted to read a book that was more objective, more of a real history book, and Pacult was the correct choice. The author summarizes his research, his purpose, and book this way in the preface: the Jim Beam Bourbon saga, I came to realize over the years, is one part family history, one part riveting fireside tale about the opening of the Western frontier, one part American memorabilia scrapbook, and one part international business opus. The Jim Beam Bourbon saga can only be told as a story that is inextricably interwoven into the tale of America becoming an independent nation and, in time, the world's foremost industrial and commercial power. Preface, page 12. The author absolutely combined all four of those elements in a masterful manner. So if you want to know a little bit about American history as it relates to whiskey and even vodka and wine, the splash of the wild frontier, the gut-wrenching Civil War, and the Great Depression with the big ice cube of Prohibition splashed in, and then the long struggle to come back from that experiment, this book is for you. If you are especially interested in bourbon, Jim Beam in particular, obviously, then this book is for you. Now, there are 3 or 4 chapters that I want to say are my favorites. Chapter 1 tells the story of America and distilled spirits from 1607 to 1810. This is a great chapter because it gives a view of the first colonists at Jamestown and even Plymouth, the social conditions of the early colonies. It tells us that the first commercial distillery was from the Dutch in New Netherland, Staten Island, by Willem Kieft in 1640. But by 1645, there were so many producers of ale and cider in Virginia that the Virginia General Assembly had to introduce some price controls. He tells the story of how America moved from applejack and brandy to rum and whiskey to bourbon. By the mid-1700s, the majority of farms of every size throughout the colonies, north to south, east to west, considered a pot still as standard equipment. Distilling was more a matter of economic practicality and farm business efficiency than it was luxury or a leisure pursuit. Page 9. I'm going to read a little bit of quotes here from pages 10 to 11. The enjoyment of spirits within the farming and village communities was not considered anything but ordinary. In fact, the mores of the era dictated that it was impolite not to offer house guests a spirituous libation. In his book, Kentucky Bourbon, The Early Years of Whiskey Making, author Henry G. Krauge recounts a report by an 18th century gentleman by the name of Peter Cartwright, who in his autobiography wrote, "From my earliest recollection, drinking drams in family and social circles was considered harmless and allowable society. And if a man would not have it in his family, his harvest, his house raisings, log rollings, weddings, and so on, he was considered parsimonious and unsociable. And many, even professors of Christianity, would not help a man if he didn't have spirits and treat the company. Even the clergy of the period, these mortal conduits to the ear of the eternal spirit, freely partook of liquid spirits, the terrestrial essence of grain and fruit. Is it total folly, when you ponder it, to theorize that their Sunday morning homilies perhaps became more eloquent and animated following a brief trip to the cloakroom where a jug of perry or pear cider might be carefully stowed among liturgical vestments? In an effort to curb the worst cases of clerical inebriation, the Virginia General Assembly, for example, passed rules governing pastoral behavior in 1631 and again in 1676. Ministers found guilty of drunkenness were fined up to half a year's pay in the most grievous instances. While open and free consumption by any adult of beverage alcohol was viewed as acceptable behavior in the colonies, imbibing to excess in public was most assuredly not looked on favorably. Drunkenness simply was not tolerated in these tight, small communities that regarded self-discipline, politeness, and restraint as high-level virtues. Inebriation was considered a display of bad manners, a problem of the whole community, not just the offender and his or her family, and was usually dealt with harshly and swiftly by the community leaders. So that's just a little sample of Pacult's work. He tells us in this chapter about Johannes Jacob Boehm, Boehm. His birthplace was likely to have been in Pennsylvania about 1755 to 60, and he was probably a first or second generation American born of immigrant parents or grandparents. He tells us how Kentucky was settled and how the whiskey distilled there eventually got called bourbon. But nobody knows for certain who initially aged corn whiskey in charred oak barrels. Elijah Craig people, sorry. Chapter 3 tells us the story of the Civil War from the perspective of the Boehm family in Kentucky. Now that was a gut-wrenching chapter at times because the war was so awful. But it also tells a story of how the Boehm family survived and continued on producing Old Tub bourbon. If I'd been thinking, I would have bought some Old Tub bourbon. He gives us a lot of tax and political history of Kentucky, and I found that fascinating as well. In fact, it seems to be one of the themes throughout the book, the government and its relationship to whiskey. And if you study Irish whiskey, if you study Scotch whiskey, the tax situation with government is always an issue with the making of whiskey. And I watched just a video the other day of Whiskey Vault. I think it was Whiskey Vault with Daniel Whittington. And he was explaining why craft whiskeys cost so much. And there's like no fewer than like 6 taxes that go into whiskey. I think it's actually more than that. But whiskey is just taxed to death. That's just how it's always been. But the theme that hits hardest is in chapter 4, Jim Boehm and the making of a bourbon whiskey brand. This is where government really comes into play because it's the sad story of Prohibition. This chapter alone is worth the price of the book. He tells the story of the temperance movement from start to finish. The passing of the 18th Amendment in some detail. Yeah, the temperance movement goes all the way back to the 1780s, 1789, and was a combining of a real social problem with religious fundamentalism and politics. The author then zooms into the Boehm family business to show how they survived during the years of Prohibition, though barely. After Prohibition, the Boehms had to borrow lots of money to get started again, whereas the Canadians and Scotch simply opened the floodgates and their whiskey poured into America. And therefore, Canadian whiskey and Scotch became hugely popular. In the late 1930s, the Boehms changed the name of their product from Old Tub to Colonel James B. Boehm, and then a few years later to Jim Boehm Kentucky Straight Bourbon. The Boehms brand survived, but many others did not. Although I will say that in recent years, a lot of the brands that went out of business during Prohibition have been brought back. And he tells us some of those stories as well about how, those name brands some of them start coming back. Not all of them, but some of them. After Prohibition, the Boehms, again, had to borrow all this money, which means control of the business eventually passed out of their hands to the investors, right? But the Boehms have continued on as the master distillers, as the guys running the business for the investors. The following chapters give us the story of the growth of bourbon as it slowly climbed back up to the top of the spirits ladder. And the pinnacle of success, really, in 1964, when Congress named bourbon as the distinctive product of the United States. However, he also tells a tale of how vodka began creeping up from behind to challenge whiskey. Chapter 9 is another masterful story. Here, Booker Noe, Big Man Small Batch, title of the chapter. He explains how small batch bourbons became a thing with Booker Noe. He was experimenting with bourbon, and word got out to the people who were in charge of the business. They said, hey, let's try some of your experimental bourbon, and they liked it. And then they said, let's market this and sell it. And small batch bourbon became a thing. And his was cask strength. So there you go. And then you see that's how whiskey used to be. The whiskey of yesteryear, they would distill it and put it in the cask, and then they would sell it by the cask, and they didn't have bottling back in the day. And so on the wild frontier, you got pretty much cask strength whiskey, although a lot of unscrupulous guys would water it down or dilute it with other stuff. But if you bought it legit, then it was going to be cask strength. And so now Booker Noe started doing that for Jim Beam. So his discussion in this chapter, it discusses the interplay between the GI generation and the baby boomers, the rise of different eating trends, and how that affected their approach to alcohol. And this chapter was particularly fascinating for me because he weaves together everything from, family life and eating, how you're raised, and TV, all this stuff, and the impact that had on alcohol. And it was just hugely fascinating. That's another favorite chapter. Well, the book concludes with Pacult's evaluation of 10 Jim Beam products, and that chapter was very interesting. He's got a 5-star rating scheme here, and here's the highlights. Baker's 7-year 107 proof gets 4 stars. Basil Hayden's 40 proof or 80 proof is the lightest and least impressive bourbon, only 2 stars. Booker's bourbon at 122 plus proof is a 4-star. The regular Jim Beam white label is a 3-star. Jim Beam rye is only a 2-star. Jim Beam black is a 4-star, along with Knob Creek 9. So, were any of those 5 stars? I think there was a couple of 5-star ratings for beams that I've never heard of or seen, and so it's like probably distillery only stuff. So that's why I didn't even mention those. But the spectrum runs from 2 to 5 stars with Jim Beam products. Well, in conclusion of the 2 books that I have now read about Jim Beam, this is the superior book. I do wish that liquor stores and bars had a book section that stocked books about the whiskeys, beers, and wines and other spirits that they sell. And this book would be top shelf. I highly recommend it for anyone fascinated with Jim Beam or the story of liquor in American history. And if you work in the industry, you really do need this book. Now, if you're a college student writing a paper on Prohibition or the story of liquor in America, this is a great resource. The only way this book could be improved, really, is if he included footnotes or endnotes. I could tell it was well researched, and he does, give some references to some of his sources, but I would appreciate footnotes or endnotes. But oh well, the book is over 20 years old now. Well, this is Stab the Dragon for Jim Beam and for Mr. Pacult and his book American Still Life. Out here.